Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something pretty complex, but honestly really essential. We're trying to cut through all the noise around U.S.-China relations.
That's right. We've got this stack of source material, quite detailed actually, looking at what they term the anti-China cards the U.S. has been playing over the last few years.
Yeah, everything from trade, tech, even sovereignty issues. It's quite a range.
And, if there's one big takeaway from combing through all this research, it's this central question: why keep escalating the pressure, and what's actually happening as a result?
All right.
Because the analysis strongly suggests these strategies, which were meant to, slow China down and keep the U.S. on top, well, they're either not working or
Or they're backfiring.
exactly. In some pretty critical ways, they seem to be creating more problems back home for the U.S. than they're solving strategically.
Wow, okay. That's a bold claim right out of the gate. Let's definitely unpack that. Where should we start? Maybe with the economic side. That
Yeah.
seems to be causing a lot of pain right now in the U.S.
Makes sense. Let's start with the trade war. That was really one of the first big moves. Yeah, the trade war. Kicked off over 3 years ago now. And the sources we looked at, they're pretty specific on the financial hit.
How so?
Well, based on reports from U.S. companies themselves, this is their data, something like 90%, maybe more, of the cost of those increased tariffs. It landed squarely on U.S. businesses.
Wait, 90%? Not on the Chinese firms it was aimed at.
Apparently not the vast majority of it.
Ugh.
The analysis indicates Chinese firms only absorbed about, 7.6% of the cost.
So, hang on. If the goal is to pressure China economically, but U.S. companies and eventual consumers paid almost all the cost, that sounds less like strategy and more like, well, a self-inflicted wound, like a domestic tax hike, almost.
That's a good way to put it. A self-inflicted economic wound. And the timing couldn't have been worse, really. It landed right alongside this nasty mix of three major crises hitting the U.S. economy all at once.
Okay, what are we talking about?
Well, first, you've got persistent inflation. The materials point to the CPI, Consumer Price Index, jumping 6.2% year on year. They flag that as like a 30 or 31-year high.
Ouch. And that hits people directly, right? Everyday costs.
For sure, especially essentials. Gasoline prices, for instance, were up nearly 50% during that period mentioned in the sources. Just massive increases.
Okay, so inflation is number one. What's two?
Number two is linked, really. The debt situation and all the money printing. The sources suggest the U.S. response, printing more money to handle domestic issues, basically ended up exporting inflation globally.
And worsening its own debt problem in the process.
Correct. And then the third piece of this triad is the supply chain chaos.
Ah, yes, the empty shells and the ships stuck offshore.
Exactly. Made worse by the pandemic, labor shortages. You had widespread port congestion, supermarkets struggling to stock basic goods, and, that lack of supply just fed back into the inflation problem, pushed prices even higher.
Okay, so here's the really wild part, according to the analysis. Despite this trade war, despite the tariffs. Yeah.
The data indicates that because China got its pandemic situation under control relatively effectively, global manufacturing orders, they actually kept flowing to China.
So U.S. firms didn't stop buying.
Quite the opposite, it seems. They were actively buying, even stockpiling Chinese goods. And the result, China's trade surplus with the U.S. actually went up massively.
Oh, wow. So the very imbalance the trade war was supposed to fix got worse.
Exactly. It's hard to call that economic card a win when the outcome is the opposite of what you intended.
It really demonstrates how deep that economic interdependence runs. It's tougher to break than maybe some policymakers thought.
So, if the economic pressure didn't work as planned,
Then the competition just shifts focus, right? It naturally escalates.
Right.
And then the next big battleground was inevitably technology.
right, the tech war. Let's talk about that pivot. Things like the actions against Huawei, trying to blacklist key companies, the executive orders on chips. The goals seemed pretty clear. Cut off China's high-tech development at the knees.
Yeah, the intent was definitely to cripple their progress. And the materials confirm, look, Huawei did suffer significant losses, no doubt about that.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, the but is the strategic damage the U.S. might have inflicted on itself. The whole approach really messed up the global supply chain.
Causing those chip shortages we talked about earlier.
Exactly,
Yeah.
even within U.S. industries. And our analysis points out something crucial. U.S. chip makers are now losing ground, potentially long-term access, to the world's biggest consumer market, China.
So trying to hobble the rival ended up hurting domestic players, too. Another self-inflicted wound, maybe?
It certainly looks that way from the data presented. It's a classic example of unintended consequences.
And speaking of unintended consequences,
Yeah.
did this tech pressure actually slow China down, or did it just change their approach?
That's the other key finding here. The pressure seems to have lit a fire under China's drive for self-reliance. Technological self-innovation became, a national priority.
Because they had no other choice.
Pretty much. If you can't buy it, you have to build it. And you see the results, according to the sources, in areas where they were heavily blocked.
Like space.
Right. Successful missions to Mars, the far side of the moon, these aren't small things. Their own navigation system, Beidou, getting fully operational.
And the space station, I remember reading about that.
Yeah, the Tiangong space station. The sources note that over 20 countries applied to cooperate on experiments there. And interestingly, the U.S. application was deemed, unqualified.
So the blockade maybe accelerated their progress in some areas rather than stopping it.
It certainly seems to have fueled their determination. Now, shifting gears a bit, away from pure tech to sort of diplomatic legal pressure.
You mean the Meng Wanzhou case? The Huawei executive detained in Canada for almost 3 years. The hostage card, as some might call it.
Precisely. That's a prime example of using long-arm jurisdiction to exert pressure. The sources we looked at frame her eventual release, after really intense pressure from Beijing, as a major setback for that specific tactic.
So it showed that kind of coercive legal move wasn't foolproof.
It demonstrated its limits, certainly. It wasn't the checkmate some might have hoped for.
Okay, now let's get into the really sensitive stuff. The sovereignty cards. Hong Kong, Xinjiang, South China Sea. These are major friction points. Let's start with Hong Kong.
Right. The material suggests the U.S. played this card pretty openly. It even cites that example of a high-profile U.S. politician calling the riots there a beautiful sight.
A provocative statement, to say the
Yes,
least.
Extremely. And China's response, it was swift, decisive. The national security law,
Which effectively shut down the protest movement.
it established what the sources call an untouchable red line. Yeah. It neutralized the separatist forces. But crucially, China didn't just react defensively.
What do you mean?
They went on the offensive, using their own new tool, the anti-foreign sanctions law. They started targeting U.S. entities, specific personnel. The sources mentioned former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross as one example.
So tit for tat. Impose sanctions on us, we impose sanctions on you.
Basically signaling that the era of unilateral U.S. sanctions without consequences was over. It changed the dynamic.
Okay, what about Xinjiang? That's obviously incredibly contentious. How do the sources handle that?
It's interesting. They primarily approach it through a comparison, a juxtaposition.
Of what?
On one hand, they present China's narrative, claims of stability in Xinjiang, citing figures like over 4 years without a terror attack, hosting 200 million tourists in 2019.
Okay.
And then they contrast that directly with the outcomes of the U.S.-led global war on terror. They pull stats, citing Brown University research.
What kind of stats?
Stark ones. Like the 20-year U.S. campaign resulted in an estimated 810,000 deaths, displaced something like 37 million people.
Wow. So the implied comparison is about the effectiveness and the human cost of different counterterrorism approaches?
That seems to be the underlying point the sources are making, yes. Highly divergent outcomes and cost.
And the South China Sea. Constant tension there with naval operations.
Yeah, the sources describe it as this ongoing cycle. U.S. and allied naval patrols, freedom of navigation operations, and then immediate large-scale responses from the PLA.
Like military drills.
Massive drills, yeah, and large blockade exercises. It's portrayed as a strategy of persistent presence and forceful pushback. The material even mentions U.S. ships getting rich life experiences from being constantly shadowed by Chinese vessels.
So maintaining presence, asserting claims, but avoiding direct shots fired, mostly.
It's a calibrated tension. Finally, in this section, there was the whole issue around the pandemic's origins, the virus tracing card.
The Wuhan lab leak theory and the effort to shift blame.
Right. And the analysis highlights China's response here as a significant shift in their strategic communication.
How so? They didn't just deny it.
They went beyond denial. They immediately launched a counter-narrative, demanding investigations into U.S. facilities like Fort Detrick.
Really turning the spotlight back.
And citing evidence from the U.S.'s own NIH suggesting COVID might have been circulating in the U.S. way back in December 2019. The key point, according to this analysis, wasn't just defense. It was China actively trying to set the agenda in the global conversation.
Taking control of the narrative, not just reacting to it.
Exactly, a much more proactive communication strategy.
Okay, so we've walked through all these different cards: economic, tech, diplomatic, sovereignty, even narrative control. It begs the bigger question. Why this shift? Why did the U.S. move away from, 40 years of engagement policy towards this much more confrontational stance?
That's the core question, isn't it? The sources trace this back to a consensus that really solidified in U.S. policy circles around 2017.
What was the consensus?
Essentially, that the long-standing engagement policy had, failed. Not failed to make China richer, obviously. It became the world's second biggest economy.
Right.
But it failed in its implicit goal, that economic integration would lead to political change inside China, making it more like the U.S.
And it didn't.
It didn't. China got strong, but it didn't change politically in the way Washington expected or hoped. And that realization, that disappointment, is what fundamentally drove the shift.
Leading to that official designation in the 2017 National Security Strategy.
Exactly. Defining China formally as a strategic competitor. That was the turning point, codifying the new approach.
Which explains the underlying logic for all these cards we've been discussing.
Precisely. Now, fast forward to the current administration, Biden's team. They inherited this confrontational posture.
And largely continued it, at least initially.
Yes. Partly because, domestic political climate in the U.S. is so polarized. Being tough on China is one of the few bipartisan things, seemingly. And also keeping the pressure on gives you leverage, or so the thinking goes.
But the sources mention a change, a slight shift.
A micro-adjustment is how they term it, happening around late summer. The sheer weight of those domestic crises we talked about earlier, the inflation, the supply chains, another COVID wave.
Reality biting back.
It seems so. It's source of recognition that, like it or not, cooperation with Beijing was unavoidable on huge global issues. Climate change, pandemic response, economic stability. You just can't tackle those alone.
So domestic problems are forcing a rethink of foreign policy strategy. That internal pressure sounds intense.
It leads to this really interesting metaphor the sources use to contrast the two countries' strategic footing right now.
Oh, what's that?
They describe the U.S. as having a chaotic heart. The Chinese phrase is Jin Han Luan, kind of internal turmoil, lack of direction.
And they back that up?
They point to polling data, like one recent poll showing 70% of Americans feel the country is on the wrong track. 70%.
That's a staggering number. A real lack of internal consensus.
It really is. And then, in contrast, they characterize China as having a steady heart, Jin Handing. Meaning a sense of confidence derived from their belief in the success of their own development model, socialism with Chinese characteristics. They feel they're on the right path.
And that difference in internal feeling chaotic versus steady must impact how they approach strategy, right? Patience, long-term thinking.
Absolutely. It dramatically affects strategic patience, the willingness to weather storms and play the long game, which brings us right to what the sources call the century question.
Which is?
Given this deep conflict, ideologically, economically, what's the right mindset? How can these two superpowers manage this intense contention without breakdown? The phrase used is du et bupo.
Fighting without breaking things completely.
Sort of, yeah. Competing fiercely but avoiding total rupture. And the conclusion drawn in the analysis is pretty firm. Cooperation, ultimately, isn't just nice to have. It's the only viable path forward for global stability.
Okay, let's shift to maybe the most dangerous flashpoint of all, Taiwan. The analysis seems to expect this card will get played even more frequently.
That's the expectation, yes. Because it's so sensitive, it gets a reaction. But the sources are really clear here, stressing the immense danger. They explicitly call escalating on Taiwan playing with fire.
High stakes. What do the sources suggest is the U.S. motivation here? Why keep pushing on such a sensitive issue?
The analysis points to a kind of dual interest for the U.S. On one hand, Taiwan is seen as a reliable customer, almost like an ATM for military sales. It's a guaranteed revenue stream for the defense industry.
Okay, the arms sales aspect.
But on the other hand, the experts cited believe the U.S. absolutely, positively does not want to get dragged into a direct shooting war with China over Taiwan.
So sell weapons, show support, but avoid actual military confrontation.
That seems to be the tightrope they're trying to walk. Maintain strategic ambiguity, provide support, but keep a clear distance from direct conflict with another major power.
And China's position, what's their red line, according to this material?
It's presented as completely unequivocal. Any move towards formal Taiwan independence is based on, quote, wishful thinking.
Strong words.
And they reiterate the legal basis in the anti-secession law. If that law is violated, the sources state plainly, non-peace for means will be used.
And what about the U.S. role in that scenario?
The assessment in these sources is quite blunt. They assert the U.S. would likely flee quickly,
rather than engage in a direct, large-scale conflict with China over the island.
That's a stark prediction about U.S. commitment. Now, beyond the U.S. and China, what about the allies? How do these strategies impact them? Sometimes it seems counterproductive.
Oh, definitely counterproductive in some cases. The analysis highlights this specifically. Take the Ayuko submarine deal.
Right. That infuriated France, a major NATO ally.
Exactly. Alienated a key partner. But look even closer, say, at Australia, a very close U.S. ally, right?
Yes.
They got drawn into the diplomatic friction with China. And what happened? They lost huge market share for key exports, meat, grain, wine, etc., to China.
Ouch. That must have hurt their economy.
Significantly. But here's the real kicker, the irony pointed out in the sources.
Yeah.
Who stepped in to fill that gap in the Chinese market, selling meat and grain?
Yeah.
Often, it was U.S. companies. And Brazilian ones, too.
Wait, so U.S. policy contributed to its ally losing business, and then U.S. businesses benefited?
That's what the analysis suggests happened in some key sectors. It reveals a kind of short-sighted self-interest that really can't help but undermine trust within alliances over the long term. It makes building that united front much harder. #HatOutro. So we circle back to that core principle discussed in the research contention without breakdown. Do erbupo, what does it require?
Good question.
Well, for Beijing, the sources suggest it means sticking firmly to your core interests, especially sovereignty. No compromise there. But at the same time, actively looking for common ground on these big global challenges. Climate, economic stability, health.
So firm on principles, flexible on cooperation.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And crucially, it also demands really rigorous worst-case scenario planning. You need to be prepared for things to go wrong, even if your main strategy is patience and seeking stability.
Okay, so for you, the listener, what's the big takeaway from this deep dive, beyond just the headlines of conflict?
I think the key thing is understanding that this competition isn't just about reacting, it's about strategic thinking.
Like what the source is called setting the agenda.
Exactly. Not just responding to the other side's moves, but shaping the conversation, anticipating shifts. And maybe, sometimes, it's about strategic patience waiting for the opponent to make a significant error.
Like the analysis suggests happened with the trade war, perhaps? Where the blowback was worse than the intended impact?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
It's about understanding those dynamics.
All right, so that leaves us with our final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Go for it.
If U.S. foreign policy, as some argue, is heavily influenced, maybe even driven, by these really short domestic electoral cycles, 2 years for Congress, 4 for the president.
Yeah.
Can a truly long-term, rational, cooperative strategy towards a competitor like China ever fully take hold? Or will the pressures of domestic politics, maybe that deep state preference for ideological conflict, always tend to override purely pragmatic national interests in the end?
That tension between short-term political needs and long-term strategic goals.
That seems to be the fundamental dilemma shaping the future of this incredibly important relationship. Something to think about.